In the second half of the lecture, we'll look at the other major way of classifying languages, which is genetic classification. So if we think about the languages in the world, the estimate that's often given is that there are about 6,000 to 7,000 of them. That number is kind of vague, right? And there are at least three reasons why it is that vague. One is that there are parts of the world where we just don't know how many languages there are because the languages haven't been fully documented. So, for example, Sub-Saharan Africa and Amazonia are two areas where we don't even really know exactly all the language varieties that exist. Another reason, as you know, is that the boundary between what is a language and what is a dialect is a bit fuzzy. Sometimes it's hard to decide if two different language varieties are different languages or dialects of the same language. So that introduces a bit of uncertainty to the number. And another reason is that we could never be totally sure is that languages are always going extinct these days. It's estimated that every 3 months or so another language goes extinct. Just as a really broad orientation to how many languages are out there, here's a pie chart showing the number of languages that are native to each part of the world. Excuse me. Another way of another kind of orientation to languages that are out there. So here we've classified languages according to the number of speakers that they have, right? So, and in this chart, the textbook does it slightly differently. I've separated out the people who speak the languages as a second language, treated that almost as a separate language. So if you look, the language with by far the most speakers in the world is Mandarin. Uh, and then coming in a quite distant second is English as a second language, right? So there are actually more second language speakers of English than there are first language speakers. Um, Next up is Spanish, and then there's English as a first language. Right, so if you put together the first language and second language English speakers, it would come before Spanish even more decisively. Still wouldn't be as many as Mandarin, though. And then other languages going down the list, Hindi, Arabic. I wanted to point out there's a mistake in the textbook that Arabic has been completely omitted, and that's a pretty big omission. So Arabic has quite a few speakers and definitely belongs in the chart in this position. Then there's Portuguese, then Bengali, another language spoken in India, along with Hindi. Then there's Mandarin as a second language, right? So like English, Mandarin is learned by a lot of speakers as a second language. Continuing Russian, Japanese, Hindi as a second language, Russian as a second language, Urdu, which is closely related to Hindi as a second language, Javanese, and German. And we could go on and on, right? So these are just the first few languages with the largest numbers of speakers. So that was an orientation to the picture of how many languages there are across the world. So now we're going to talk about genetic classification, which is, as I mentioned previously, classifying languages according to their ancestry. So there's a term language family, and this refers to a group of languages that all developed from the same ancestor language. Right? So the same as a human, or a biological family that all goes back to a particular ancestor. Languages that all developed from a single ancestor language, we say that those languages are genetically related. Right? This doesn't have anything to do with human genetics. It's just a term genetics. It's like linguistic genetics. Right? It's a linguistic use of that term. So an example of a language family that most of you have probably heard of is the Romance languages. Right? So the Romance languages, like French and Spanish, these are languages that all developed from Latin. Now, you might wonder, well, what does that mean, developed from Latin? How does a parent language like Latin give rise to daughter languages like French and Spanish? We're going to look more at that pretty soon in chapter 8, which is about historical linguistics. But basically what happens, well, as you know, any living language is always changing. That's just a fact about languages. So, and then what happens if you take the speakers of a language and separate them into different groups? For example, if some of the speakers move to a different area, right? Well, then the language is going to keep changing, but now it's going to be changing differently because those two groups are separate. They're not sharing the same changes anymore. There's nothing to guarantee that all the changes are going to be the same. What we'll get out of that is different dialects, right? The language will take on a different character in the two different areas. And then if you keep that going for centuries and centuries, the changes build up to the point that the dialects are not mutually intelligible anymore. People can't understand each other anymore. And what you've got at that point is different languages. This is exactly what happened in order for Latin to turn into languages such as French, Spanish, and Italian, and so on. Now, there's an important point that if languages are genetically related, it means they go back to a common ancestor. It doesn't mean they're similar. Um, because the parent language might have been spoken a very, very long time ago. And the daughter languages that descended from that parent language, they may have diverged. They may have become different, right? To such an extent that it's not even obvious just from looking at them that they're even related anymore. Right? Now, there is a linguistic methodology for figuring out whether they're related, which we'll talk about in the historical linguistics chapter, but just at a glance, they might not look similar. So to take an example, the English sentence, it has to be figured out, in Latvian, you would say something like, ja is gudro. Now, English and Latvian are in fact genetically related. English and Latvian share a parent language, which is called Proto-Indo-European. And this parent language was spoken approximately 6,000 years ago. And so if you trace the history back, English and Latvian go back to the same source, but 6,000 years is a long time. It's been long enough for enough changes to pile up that there's no obvious, recognizable similarity between English and Latvian. To take a closer example, so if you take German, you are in German, how to say that? You say du bist. Now in English, well, we say you are, but if you go back to not too long ago, there's a more archaic form in English, which is thou beest. That's an archaic form of you are. And I mean, what we see here is actually thou beest looks quite a lot like du bist, right? Thou, du sound quite similar. Beest, bist also sound quite similar. So English and German are much closer than English and Latvian. And that's because English and German also share a common ancestor, but a much more recent one. So English and German share the common ancestor called Proto-Germanic, which is a language that was spoken approximately 2,500 years ago. And so still lots of time for German and English to diverge, but at least up until about a century or two ago, du bist, thou beest sounded very similar. Of course, modern English has diverged further, and we say in modern English you are, which doesn't really sound similar to du bist at all. Right? So again, the divergence is always expanding. So a language family is a group of languages that are genetically related, meaning they all go back to a single shared ancestor language. There are well over 100 of these language families in the world. So on this map, every different colored area represents a different language family. There are also quite a few of what are called language isolates. Right? So an isolate is a language that doesn't have any relatives. Right? So it's kind of like an orphan. It's a language that it's a family all in itself, is another way of thinking about it. Okay? So we have language families, which are groups of related languages, and we have language isolates, which are languages that don't have any relatives. So something you might ask is, well, why do we have so many separate language families? Right? So if we have 100 different language families on the world, on the earth, that means that they go back to 100 different parent languages. Now, a question you might ask is, well, is that it, right? Are we saying that there are 100 different parent languages that are not related at all? Right? They're just 100 completely separate families, which would mean, if you think about the implications, that would mean that language actually came into existence 100 separate times independently. And maybe even more if we add in all the isolates, right, which also would have, if this is what we think, they would have also come into existence independently. Well, no, we don't actually think this, right? So we have 100 different parent languages, but really the relationships could go back even farther, right? It could be that those 100 parent languages are also related in ways, right, that they diverge from a common ancestor, and they may indeed all go back to a single original parent language, which would mean that really all the languages in the world are part of one great big family. The reason why we don't actually go that far when we're talking about language families is that there is a methodology that linguists use to reconstruct the history of language families and to determine which languages are related. But that methodology has a time limit. It can only go back about 10,000 years, at most 10,000 years. So really what we're saying is that 10,000 years ago, there were 100 different languages or so on the earth. And those languages have given us all the modern languages that we have. And we don't have a methodology that could bring us back any further. So, the relationships between those 10,000-year-old parent languages are unfortunately just not knowable. So the plan for this lecture, we can't obviously talk about all the language families, so I'm going to talk a little bit about each of the 5 largest language families in the world, largest in terms of having the most speakers. And then I'll take an even closer look at the largest of those 5 language families, which is the Indo-European language family.